Okay, okay, everybody. There's a couple things I want to talk about today. This lecture, I'm going to talk at some length about the mental status examination, and I realized it was interesting. I realized after the last class that I really didn't have two full classes of material to talk about with reliability and validity. But then it also hit me that we are about to enter into discussions of the full battery, meaning how you do a comprehensive examination report, a comprehensive examination. And um, uh, I didn't cover the mental status examination, and I really should because it's when you do a full battery assessment, when you do a comprehensive assessment, you will be including a number of different things. One is you will be reviewing records, so you will do a records review. You will be doing the testing and writing up the results and interpretation of the testing. You will write down behavioral observations that you have of the person. But then you also will be doing a mental status examination. And the mental status examination is really to get a picture of the person's overall uh, functional ability, their level of cognitive functioning. Now, as I said, we don't cover neurological testing much here. But I will be talking about some of the major aspects of cognitive uh, evaluation here because it makes up the Mindy mental status examination. The mental status examination. I'll talk about the mini mental status examination in a minute, but I'm going to talk about what to include in a mental status examination. Now, there's going to be a couple things. I'm going to do this lecture, and then I'm going to include two slides or two videos for you also to watch. So the videos this week will be my lecture, but there also will be two videos that I want you to do. One is a psychiatrist actually conducting a mental status examination. And then the second one is an individual, I believe it's a psychologist, conducting the mini mental status examination. The difference between those two is a mental status examination is an examination, a part of the assessment that follows specific things that you address in the interview. The mini mental status examination is an actual name of a test that you sometimes incorporate as part of your assessment. It'll be another brief instrument that you use as a gauge of the person's um, cognitive function, as a general assessment of the person's cognitive function. Now, before we do that, I do want to talk a little bit about you have just received the MMPI 2 results that you're going to use for your paper. Now, these are going to be different. This is different than the uh, than the computerized one. This is one. This is a person I actually did an MMPI 2 on years ago. Now, there's a couple things you'll notice about it. One is it's by hand. It's the hand version that I showed you. The second is some of the parts aren't filled in. Some of the supplemental scales, some of the uh, um, some of the validity scales aren't filled in. I did that because um, uh, I like this as an example for two reasons. One is the most important parts are filled in, so you're not bogged down that's with other scales that are considered secondary and aren't particularly important. And so, what you can do with those scales, with the ones that are filled, is just assume they were not clinically significant. Because I chose this because the most important scales that I want you to focus on are there. So just assume the other ones are clinically insignificant. Um, but But what I like about this scale, and I will tell you this just as a sort of uh, kind of sets the stage for it, is I have rarely had a patient with so many high scores who still had a valid um, who still had a valid profile. Um, and so I like that about this one. I like that it gives you the opportunity to really see what someone would look like with a whole bunch of scales that are clinically significant, but the validity scales are also still clinically allow for interpretation. It's a slightly high F scale, but the other ones are actually quite low. So I like that because it gives you a chance. This person has um, of the 10 clinical scales, one, two, three, four, five, six of them are um, clinically significant. I That rarely happens. I'll be honest with you. In the quote unquote real world, that rarely happens. Usually, and it's not anything to do with the MMPI. It's not like if they are that high, um, you can't score them, or or it always means it's invalid. Clearly, that's not the case here. Um, but um, but usually, it's just been my experience. Usually, if you have that many scales that are all that high, usually the validity it usually is up there invalid. I think I told you at the beginning of this class that I once had the chance to see Charles Manson's MMPI two, or at the time it was the MMPI. No, actually, it was the MMPI two because he just died a year or two ago, so it was the MMPI two. Um, and you would have thought that Charles Manson's scale would have all the, or his results would have all the scales high, and he did, but the validity scales were also off the chart. He clearly was just messing with it. But this scale is valid. So I want you to go to town with interpreting it because you've got a lot of scales to interpret there. Um, Also, one thing to point out, um, I graphed it. Um, when you have one thing we didn't talk that much about with the MMPI2 is a number of the scales have you add um, some part or all of the K scale to it. That's just how they're calculated. So you'll notice that some of them have part of the K added to it. Just go with the score that's at the bottom, the one after I add the K. There's statistical reasons why K was added to some of them to balance. It was seen as a way of um, it was seen as a way of adding a measure of how severe the person's pathology was. That's sort of the theoretical interpretation of why the K is added. Okay. Um, uh, so there you go with that. Um, so anyway, back to the mini. So let me go to the mini mental status examination here. So I'm going to talk about two things, and I'm going to show. I'm going to provide videos of two different things. One is a person conducting the mental status examination interview. So it's going to be someone conducting a mental status examination. And then the second one will be a person who is administering a test called the mini mental status examination. And if I can get a copy of it, I'll include a copy of the mini mental status examination so you can uh, follow through on it. Okay, but let me start by uh, by telling you there are 10 different parts to the mental status. So if you are doing just a mental status examination, uh, you may typically what you do is you would do a mental status examination, and then you may also include the mini mental status examination. The difference with being that the mini mental status examination is a formal instrument, so you get a score that kind of gives you a reflection of how the person's doing in terms of their cognitive functioning. So, but if you are doing the mental status examination, which is an interview, Here are the parts. With a mental status examination, you would describe the person's appearance, you would describe their behavior, you would describe their speech, and I'll go into details about what you include with these. Their speech, you would include some comments about their mood. You would include comments about their affect, and the difference between them is mood is their sustained emotional status over a prolonged period of time. So you would kind of describe how they seem to be feeling emotionally throughout uh, the time that you're meeting with them. Affect, which is the next one, affect is the person's moment to moment expression. Do they seem sad when they're talking about something sad? Or do they seem more sad? So the mood would be how they appear throughout, and the affect would be does their appearance seem to change congruent with changes in what they're talking about? So if they're talking about something happy, do they seem a little bit happier? When they're talking about sad, um, do they seem sad? Uh, or do they show no does there do they show no emotion? In another way, affect is really a reflection of how the person appears, and mood is more a combination of how they appear, sound, what they talk about, tone of voice, just generally what does their mood seem to be like. Okay, so there's mood, there's affect, there's thoughts. Uh, so, what does their thinking pattern seem to be like? And I'll discuss that in a minute. Um, their perception. Uh, so, how do they seem to? Uh, so, how do they seem to be perceiving things? When you basically perceptions, where you start talking about, do they seem to be showing signs of hallucinations, delusions, anything like that? Perceptual disturbances. Cognition. Now, cognition would be something you note, but then if you include the MMPI too, that would be really directly addressing cognition. Um, and then you would, and in fact, if you talked about the MMPI, I mean, I'm sorry, the MMPI, if you talked about the mini mental status examination, if you used the mini mental status examination as a measure, you might include the results of the mini mental status examination here. Insight would be the next section, and then the final section would be clinical judgment and risk assessment. Do they seem to be suicidal? Um, um, that sort of do they seem to be drinking too heavily? What are some of the risk factors? Okay, and let me go through what are some of the things you look for um, in each section. So appearance, you would describe um, if the person seems to be appropriately groomed, if they seem to be disheveled. Disheveled means their clothing is all over the place. Does it look so? Things you would address in appearance is do they appear their stated age? Do they appear older than they look? Um, does their clothing um, seem appropriate? You know, if it's 40 degrees out there, are they wearing shirts and a t-shirt? Um, does their clothing seem dirty? Does it seem messed up? Um, do they seem to be too casually dressed or too formally dressed for the interview? Uh, what is their posture like? What is their gait like? Do they seem to have any problems walking in and out? Do they seem to have taken care of their hygiene appropriately? Are they showing any evidence of self harm? Are they showing any evidence of neglect? Does it look like they haven't slept in a while or eaten in a while? Do they come in smelling of alcohol, or does it look like uh, they're um, uh, they're under the influence of something? In my number of years of practice, if I had to pick one thing that I've been surprised by looking back, I'd say I would say I've been surprised at the number of people who've come in for a clinical interview who've been drunk. Like I could tell they're drunk. You know, they smell of alcohol, or they sound, which always seems bizarre. I mean, I can understand having an alcohol problem, but you would think, you know, you would cancel the appointment if you were going to get drunk, or at least not do it. So that's actually surprised me when it's happened. So you never know. I mean, so you might think, well, do I have to note if they smell of alcohol? Yeah, they may come in under the influence of alcohol. Um, Behavior is the next one. Now, I will tell you, I do a mental status examination, and I also will um, maybe have a separate section on behavioral observations. Now, partly I think that's because I specialize in, you know, my area of specialization is behavioral psychology. So I really address the behaviors. But the difference I see is the behaviors is um, more, you know, their behavior in response to questions, their behavior in response to the interview, and then the behavior section I might give um, summarizing their behavior, you know, at different times during the interview. But you don't have to do that. You can just include behavior under the as part of the mental status examination, and have a uh, sentence or two where you talk about the person's behavior. So some of the things you want to address under the behavior section is were there any noteworthy gestures? Did they have tics? Did they um, seem to have twitches? Were they restless? Did they have any noteworthy mannerisms? What was their body language like? What were their facial expressions like? Um, did they have any behaviors that seemed impulsive? What was their rapport like? Did they engage appropriately with you? Did they seem angry to be there? Did they seem like they were overtly making clear to you that they didn't want to be there? Did they seem alert? Okay, and then with speech, you want to take notice of things like the rate and flow of their speech. Did it seem normal? Did the volume seem normal? If the volume changed, could you tell why it changed? Did they seem to get louder for no apparent reason? Um, did they provide sufficient information for answering the questions? Did you have to ask them multiple times to add additional detail because they were too limited in what they were saying? What was their rhythm like? Did they seem slurred? Did they seem hesitant in what they were saying? Did their speech show any sort of obsessive traits? So that would be speech. Next would be mood. Mood and affect are related to emotions, but in different way. Um, the mood is sort of the sustained emotional state throughout the time that we met. You know, even if someone can, you know, even depressed people smile or can laugh if they find a joke funny, or if they say something that they think is funny. Um, so mood is just your general sense of how the person's emotional state seemed to be. What was the underlying emotional state when you talked with them? Um, did they show signs of depression? Did they show signs of anxiety? One word that I wanted you to be familiar with when it comes to describing mood in a mental status examination is the word euthymic. 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 And euthymic is um, um, euthymic means appropriate to the situation. In other words, does a person seem not particularly depressed or not particularly anxious, but seem how you would expect they would feel given that they're in seeing you for an interview? Or if they, you know, if they seem sad and they talk about their dog just dying, that would be euthymic. That would be okay. That's appropriate to the situation they just described. You would want to take note of whether their mood um, seems to clearly change throughout the meeting, and that's a judgment call. I mean, I know he said mood is sort of the sustained level of emotional response. So, um, and then I'm going to talk about an affect. Affect is more the, you know, moment to moment or situation to situation appearance that the person has. So asking if their mood changes is really reflected. There seemed to be a major change in their emotional state. Did they seem to change quickly from being euthymic to being depressed? And that would suggest they seemed to be depressed and then just sort of stayed there. Um, does the mood seem constant or does it seem to change during the time that you meet? Affect is the person's moment to moment expression. That's the next part. Um, and so what you're looking at is posture, movement, body, facial expression, tone of voice. It's just your observation. Does does the affect seem to fit how the person seems to feel emotionally at the time? Um, and then the next section would be thoughts. And what you're talking about, and it's I don't call it thoughts, I call it thinking. Uh, I call it thinking pattern, but it's all the thoughts. Um, and some things you want to keep in mind about thoughts is does anything seem to be blocking their thoughts? Do they seem to get interrupted? Do they seem to have trouble focusing on their own thoughts? Does what they say seem logical? Um, is there tangential means that what they're saying is sort of relevant, but just seems to be going off in a different direction? Is there evidence of is there any evidence of delusions, obsessions, paranoia, phobia? Does a person talk about thoughts of suicide or self harm? Now, you'll do risk assessment at the end, but here's where you want to take note about whether they admit to or show evidence of suicidal ideation or homicidal ideation, any thoughts of harming themselves or anyone else. Um, here are some terms to keep in mind about things you might notice, especially with people who have psychotic disorders. Um, uh, Word salad means a whole bunch of words come out and none of them seem to be logically connected. Flight of ideas is where the person changes quickly from topic to topic. Loose associations is um, the person um, I the difference between flight of ideas and loose associations is flight of ideas means there's just a completely change of topic. Loose associations, there's a change in topic, but you can see that there's maybe some slight degree of pattern. Like they maybe uh, um, flight of ideas is quicker, and it's just clear that the person is changing abruptly. Um, Loose association isn't an abrupt change, but it's a noticeable change that the person just sort of slides into a different. Maybe they use a word, and it's like uh, I went down the street and I saw a caterpillar. Oh, I really like the book, One Friendly Caterpillar. My neighbor was really friendly when I was a kid. You see that loose association. There's like a word that sort of leads into another thought. Um, Clang association is where the person, it's sort of like what I just talked about with loose association. Instead of a word or a thought or a topic being what leads them into, it's a sound, the sound of a word. So it may be that clang association would be that the person changes what they're talking about, not based on an idea or a statement or a word, but on the letter that the word or the sound that the word starts with. Other terms when you're talking about thoughts for your assessment, one would be poverty of thought. Poverty of thought means that the person seems to have very little in their thoughts. They don't think to seem to. If you ask what they think about, the answer seems to be not much. Mutism is a refusal to speak. Um, you want to note, is there any sort of preoccupation? Um, Rumination is a just preoccupation seems to would be that one issue is at the front of their mind. Rumination is it's not at the front of their mind, it's just the only thing on their mind. It's the only thing they come back to. Um, okay, and you want to make note whether you see hallucinations or delusions, that sort of thing. Okay, now that's in the thought pattern. Um, um, perception. Um, perception is um, how the person um, seems to be responding to sensory material around them. Um, uh, does a person seem to be reacting very strongly to noise? Do they seem to be um, like almost unable to get their eyes off of one particular part of the room? Um, perception, this is where you would start, this is where you would really hone in on hallucinations or delusions. You might note under the thought pattern that the person might seem to be responding to internal stimuli or seems to be hallucinating. And then um, perception, which would be the next sentence or next couple sentences you address. Perception talks more specifically about what does the person see. Do they seem to be hallucinating about someone else being in the room? Do they seem to be hallucinating about smelling something or hearing a voice? You know where so and notice, by the way, keep in mind that when you write up a mental status exam, it's usually a paragraph or two or three. So you're kind of writing sentence after it, you might have all 10 sections sort of as subheadings, but most of the time what you would do is just be writing it in a narrative form. And so if you think of it that way, you talk about whether there seems to be hallucinations or delusions present, and then in the next sentence you would talk about what exactly they seem to be hallucinating or be delusional about. Smelling certain things, hearing certain things, what what perceptions are they responding to? Um, and so cognition is where you would really talk about the person's cognitive status and some of the main parts of cognitive status. And you'll see this when we talk about the mini mental status examination. Would be are they oriented? Oriented. Uh, it's often described as oriented to time, place, and person. Meaning, does the person know where they are, what time it is, and who they are, who important people are. So being oriented to time means you know the year, date, time of the day. Uh, I'm sorry, it's called oriented to time, place, and person. Time means they're oriented to things like year, date, day of the week. Place means they know where they're at, where they live. Person means they know who they are, who you are, who the important people are in their life. You would test memory uh, by asking them to recall things that have happened recently, immediately, recently, and long term. On the mini mental, you'll see, and oftentimes I'll include this just even as a separate, is you might ask them like to remember 4 or 5 words, and then you would ask them to repeat them. That's immediate memory, and then ask them to remember 5 minutes later. That's recent memory. Um, you want to you might want to test the visual spatial skills. Usually, this is um, on the mini mental status examination. Uh, uh, this task is on there, but even if you're not given the full mini mental status examination, one that a lot of people uh, utilize. And actually, no, this isn't on the mini mental status examination. It's on another mental status examination test. One task that a lot of people will use, especially with older individuals, for visual spatial functioning, is called the draw a clock test. It's basically asking the person to draw a clock, and the time is always 11:10. I don't know why they picked that, but the time that's on his draw clock and show the clock at 11:10, and that is considered to be a very um, accurate. That is considered to be a very effective means of testing for dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease. Someone who can't accomplish that and what you look for is, do they draw the circle of a clock? Do they draw the numbers correctly? Are they proportional? And do they draw the hands correctly? And drawing the hands correctly means, is one hand bigger than the other? Okay. And you're looking to test their memory, you're looking to test their visual spatial skills. Um, you also want to test for attention. One test that's often used for attention, that's a very good one, is to ask the person to repeat a set of 5 numbers forward and then ask them to repeat a set of 4 numbers backwards. So you give them 5 numbers and you have them repeat them, and then you give them 4 numbers and you have them repeat them backwards. Actually, I'm sorry. The backwards is 3 numbers. So it's 5 numbers forwards and 3 numbers backwards. Um, Insight, um, you want to, you want to see how well they understand why they're there. If they don't admit to having a problem, at least do they have insight as to what everybody else thinks is the problem? What is their judgment and opinion about the problem? Do they show a willingness to try to work with healthcare and get some sort of treatment for their problem? Do they seem to be two main factors with insight are they aware of the problem and are they accepting of the problem? By the way, which may be two different things. They are two different things. Someone may be aware of a problem but not very accepting of it. And then the 10th is you use a uh, you determine your clinical judgment and risk assessment of the person. Um, Actually, clinical judgment is just where you would um, actually, this is considered to be a separate part. So the first 9 parts are all things you would include in one section of the mental status, whether it's one paragraph or two. And then you would have a separate paragraph with clinical judgment and risk assessment. Clinical judgment would be your general impression of the person's uh, overall mental status, and risk assessment would be whether you uh, feel the person is at any risk to themselves or others. Now, if you were just doing a mental status examination, if you're doing an intake with somebody, you may just be asked, at a facility where maybe you're interviewing someone who's a new patient, you may just be asked to do a mental status examination. In that case, the clinical judgment and risk assessment would be at the bottom. In the case of a full battery assessment, like we're talking about, you would include the clinical judgment and risk assessment that you have from the mental status examination at the end of your report, where you would incorporate it with all the test material you have. So, clinical judgment and risk assessment is a separate part of the mental status examination where you draw your conclusions about the person's diagnosis and uh, uh, what you think are causing the problems, what you think needs to be addressed, and how likely the person is to cooperate with treatment. And then you also would talk about what risk you think you have to themselves and others. Like I said, if you're just doing a clinical um, mental status examination, you would include that right at the end of the mental status examination. If you were doing a full battery assessment, you would incorporate that at the end, where you would mix it together with all your other with the test materials that you have. Okay, but I went kind of off the grid here a second as I was pulling up, and I'm going to show you this. Now I'm going to go into a mini mental status examination. Now, there's a lot of versions of the mini mental status examinations. Uh, this is the Folstein mini mental. There's the Montreal cognitive assessment test. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test got some attention a couple years ago because it was one they gave to President Trump. Um, so that's why. And then there's one called the St. Louis. Um, I'm sorry. The St. Um, Lewis cognitive measure. But this is just to show you what's in Mental. And what I liked about this version, it has I can show you the scoring at the end. But here are some of the tasks. So again, this is you get a score at the end of this. So this is seen as a gauge of the person's overall cognitive functioning. So you would start by asking orientation questions. What is the year, season, date, day, month? Where are we now? What state are we in? What county, what town, what is the name of the facility, and what floor are we on. And then the next thing you would do is you would give three unrelated objects uh, uh, clearly, the names of three things. And these are words that basically what you're doing is testing testing the person's ability to remember three words that you give them. Count backwards for 100. That is seen as a test of attention. Count backwards from 100 by 7. Now, if the person can't do math, if they say they can't do math, you could have them spell the word world backwards. Then you ask them, you had, to tell you the names of the words. Again, this would be a measure of recent memory. Show the person two objects and ask them to name them. We under speech, we didn't talk about this. Naming is something you address how well the person can name things. Again, with speech, repeat the phrase no ifs, ands, or buts. Following instructions is seen as a task of speech. Take this paper in your hand, fold it in half, and put it on the floor. Notice, by the way, with the scoring that it's 3 points, so each step is a point. You would write on next one, you'd write on a piece of paper the words close your eyes, show it to the person and say, please read this and do what it says. Uh, Again, speech, make up a sentence. Make up and write a sentence about anything. It must contain a noun and a verb. And then you would have the person copy this picture. And that's amazing. And then you'd score them up. The total number of points is 30. And then here's what the scores mean. Um, um, and I'm going to go down. This is the important one. 25 to 30. Um, and no, the thing is, so even if the person gets 30, um, it's still 25 to 30. It still could reflect some mild deficits. Oftentimes, a judgment of whether you have deficits in this area is a judgment call. For instance, if someone comes in with a PhD and scores 30, it doesn't mean that they aren't dementia. I'm sorry, cognitive impairment can mean two things. One is the person is so impaired they can't function well across the board. But cognitive impairment also can be relevant if the person's functioning is worse than it was before. If a person is suffering Alzheimer's disease or suffering some form of dementia, um, that doesn't mean they're not able to function at all. That means their level of functioning is worse than it was before. And if a person has like a PhD or an advanced degree and they're scoring a 30, that may still, if they were slow in responding, if they didn't quite seem to understand your instructions, that could still be a reflection of some impairment. But like I said, here it's more of a judgment call. 20 to 25 is usually considered at least evidence of mild. 10 to 20 is considered moderate, and 0 to 10 is severe. Now, this is if they're in a facility. Some judgment here, but yeah. So there's the Folstein Mini Mental Status Examination. I will include videos that I want you to watch about two individuals conducting these evaluations. One is a mental status examination, and one is a mini mental status examination. And so I want you to review those as well, and we'll pick all this up on Thursday. So I will see you then. Have a good weekend.